The Newsagents.
This is a book from Sir Anthony Seldon, Truss at 10, which has just been published. And Sir Anthony is perhaps the most august, preeminent chronicler of contemporary British politics. He has written a book about the premiership of every Prime Minister going all the way back to Sir John Major, and indeed is an expert on many others before that as well. There is no better person to talk to, particularly at a time when we've just had a new Prime Minister come to office, about leadership, about what it takes to be a successful Prime Minister, and in particular, why Liz Truss made such a calamitous one. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's Jon.
It's Lewis.
And you kind of can't imagine that there are many more stories to tell of the 49 days.
There's only 49. How many stories can there be?
And yet. What Sir Anthony Seldon has done is kind of talk to all the key people involved. And because he is such a reliable and respected figure, people do want to talk to him. And all the other prime ministers he has spoken to, and he has spoken to those who were most closely involved in the decision making that led to certain policies being framed.
And it's exhaustive. I mean, he really does talk to everybody. He talks to hundreds of people, often more than that, if the Premiership is particularly long, for his books on Prime Ministers. And he's done so again for this book, which is obviously a unique challenge in some ways because it is such a short Premiership, and yet that's why the story is so sort of tantalising and so interesting.
I honestly think that the shortest lived Premiership is also one of the most fascinating because it's such an extraordinary study, of politics, of psychology, of delusion. All of it is all wrapped into those 49 days.
Yeah, absolutely. And it still has contemporary resonance because the Conservative Party going under its leadership contest is still in many ways sort of reeling from and having to come to terms with what happened in those 50 days or so. And also, given that Truss has, of course, famously not accepted really that she was at fault at all and is continuing to, albeit outside of Parliament, continuing to give her version of events and trying to exert a kind of political pull on the Conservative Party and its future direction, what she thinks and says and her premiership, the facts of her premiership, really do still matter. And so we're delighted to be joined now in the studio by Professor Sir Anthony Seldon. Sir Anthony, you said you weren't going to write a book on Truss, right? You said it would be impossible.
Well, it pretty much was impossible, but it just was crying out to be written because how does that happen? I mean, how do you have the shortest serving Prime Minister in history in 303 years since the office started? Back in 1721. I mean, there are so many factors pinning a Prime Minister down, locking them in once they get through that front. Bloody difficult to get through the front door, but once you are through it, so much keeps you there. And she managed to blow it.
So I was fascinated in the introduction to your book. You said that you ran into her, and she said to you, she asked you a question.
Yeah.
What did she say to you?
So, for the first time in my life, I'd been invited to the Spectator party, and there I was, and looking to see if there's anybody I knew, and suddenly there was a face very close in front of my face saying, "I hear you're writing a book about me," and it was Liz Truss, and I said, "Well, I'm not certain I am going to be," and she said, "I'm writing my own book, and I said, "Good," and then she went. And that was it. At that stage, I was undecided whether I was going to do it or not because, they take so much out of you, these books. But I thought there was something there. There was a cautionary tale about how not to do it. I mean, it's not a game.
You had written an article
Yeah.
before she became Prime Minister, basically saying how to be a successful Prime Minister based on all of the previous volumes that you've written of previous PMs. And she actually read this.
Well, it was...
so you're to blame.
It was made into... I am to blame for Liz Truss, I think Boris Johnson, and for Brexit, and for everything else, for the failure to level up and for Britain's performance in the Euros. I mean, I did produce it was a whimsical, came out as a BBC short video of some 4 minutes looking at the 10 factors that make for successful premierships, and one is to have a good and a stable relationship with your chancellor. Well, she met that. Another is to know what you're there for. I mean, it's amazing how many prime ministers turn up without really much of an idea at all about why they want to be prime minister. Another is have a loyal team around you so that you're not they're not all infighting against each other, struggling to get the attention of the boss at the top. So those were 3, and she met those, and she met the other 7, but they were based on more rational, normal people, not just the people I'd written about back to John Major, but going all the way back ultimately to Robert Walpole in 1721. But she and also Boris Johnson were so unlike that. As I write at the end of the book, I pick up Scott Fitzgerald's description of Tom and Daisy at the end of in Gatsby about they were careless people. Tom and Daisy, Boris and Liz, they smashed things up and retreated into their reveries, into their money, and left other people to clear up the mess. And that's what they did, and that's what I think the story is about.
Anthony, you talked about rationality there. Was she irrational?
No. John was frighteningly rational. She was overly rational and underly emotional. And, she loved Ronald Reagan. She loved Margaret Thatcher. Had she read Charles Moore's 3-volume book or other books on Thatcher? Unproven. If she had, she certainly hadn't taken the core point that Thatcher was emotionally intelligent. She read the opportunity. It took her 2 years to maneuver people into place and to roll the pitch and get people on side before she started unveiling what became Thatcherism. Liz Truss, like Karl Popper said about true ideologues, the more that people disagree with you, the more convinced you are about you're right. It's because they're sinister, they're wrong, they're part of a conspiracy. So when people were saying to her that you've got to slow down, you can't do this, you can't do this in this way, she wasn't prepared to listen.
So the book has a revelation, a story about her and the health service and cancer treatment. What is it?
I think the book has many revelations, but this particular story is a reflection of the fiasco of the emergency budget, and that Britain had a £72 billion black hole, which was over twice the sum of the cuts that George Osborne managed to achieve in the whole of austerity. That gives you a sense of it. And officials produced a series of possible options, a death list about the extreme measures, that the predicament that she and Kwarteng had placed the country in through not listening to advice. And on that list was taking cancer treatment, cutting it back off the NHS. Now, at least one of her team was worried that she was going to go for that. That doesn't mean that she was, but it means that people around her who were saying that she was shouting out, "We've got to find the cuts," and repeatedly, at least one of her team who knew her extremely well, was seriously worried that she might be going for that. And as a result, the team forged together and came up. They were so worried about what would happen in the city, what would happen on the financial markets unless Britain's credibility was restored, that they came up with their own plan. So it was that extreme, the predicament for the country.
Anthony, I just want to pick up on that particular point because you and I have known each other for a long time, and I know how you go about your work, and you do it seriously. So there are, because some people, Liz Truss has said this is absolute nonsense, balderdash, da-da-da-da-da. You stand by your sources for that story.
Look, people round her believed that that is what she was considering as a possible outcome. They were worried. Was she serious? I don't know. It's unknowable how serious she was. But people who knew her were worried about the black hole and where she might go to find the cuts that were necessary to try and restore credibility in this nation, because they were seriously worried. Talk was about the worst potential crisis since 1976. It was very, very dark, and she didn't seem to be understanding the gravity of it.
Anthony, as you know, Liz Truss's her own account of her premiership, has been not to do as Kwasi Kwarteng, her Chancellor, has done, which is to say that there were mistakes made. It has been to assert that in fact she was the victim of a conspiracy, that the establishment, quote unquote, the economic establishment, Treasury, the Bank of England, others, did not support the Conservative Party itself, did not support her in office, and that is why she had to leave office over such a short time. She's drawn particular attention to this idea around LDIs, liability-driven investments, and that the Treasury didn't brief her about this and what a potential problem they could be. This is a set of claims you examine in the book. What is your assessment of that claim and those claims?
If you look at the successful prime ministers in British history, they have all gone with the apparatus that you inherit. You cannot remake the world. Successful leaders in any walk of life cannot change the reality of the power structures that they face. Ultimately, she decided not to listen to the advice that she was given about having a much more balanced, nuanced, phased mini budget. She could have delayed it. So I think that it's unknowable whether it could ever have worked, whether if she had spread it out, it might have worked better. Certainly, Margaret Thatcher would not have launched in after May 1979 with all the fireworks, all guns blazing like Liz Truss did. She could have made a case, as Liz Truss did, that things are so bad, we've got to get moving very quickly and very urgently, but she didn't. She bided her time. So I do not think that there was a conspiracy by OBR, by the Treasury, by officials, civil service at large, by the city. I think that she believed that there was, and I think that some of those who believed with her originally began to doubt that by the end. And it was a revolt by her own team, who were so worried by what they were hearing in the city about what might happen unless there was a rapid change of direction, that resulted in the change of direction happening, as I lay out in the book. It's an extraordinary story.
But as you lay out in the book, she is absolutely convinced of this, even at the time, right? So you relay, you provide an account of her saying in the middle of the crisis, swearing and shouting about Tom Scholar, the recently departed Treasury official that she and Kwarteng had dismissed, saying that this was all the fault of Tom Scholar and his sort of, World Bank or OECD kind of pals and all of that sort of stuff. Even at that time, she is convinced that there is some sort of conspiracy going on.
So the book is full of quotations about what people heard her say or what they themselves thought. She had this fixed idea that there was a cabal, a blob, that was out to deny true free marketeers the vision for a growth economy. Now, look, I happen to think that she was right about growth. Of course we needed to have growth. Boris Johnson had advocated for levelling up, although levelling up didn't happen under him. There's a difference between having an objective and actually achieving it, and she was concerned to try and level up, expand the size of the cake so everyone would benefit. But she believed at the time, she still believes, and she was as wrong. She's as wrong now as she was at the time. I mean, we have to live in a world where we understand and accept what other people are saying. If to have our own notions which are so opposed to what reasonable people, experienced people are thinking all around you is very odd. And for people in the Treasury, in the Bank of England, in the OBR, across the IMF, they were all her targets, all in the city at large. She somehow had this idea that this was a conspiracy. No doubt if Britain had still been in the EU, then the EU might have been part of that same conspiracy.
Was she unusually odd as a Prime Minister? I mean, you studied lots of them.
She was unusually odd. Of course she was unusually odd. I mean, every Prime Minister is odd. Only 58 have become Prime Minister. The sacrifices you have to make, the compromises you have to make, not the least for your family and your friends to get up that greasy pole, means that you will have an outlier personality before you even start. But she was odder than most because of her irrepressible, I mean, in a way it was attractive, her irrepressible belief in her own rectitude, despite the fact that she was so out of tune, even with many free market economists who knew and worried and vexed, as the book talks about, that she was doing it too quickly and in the wrong way. The other things, the book is set around 10 qualities which I then reframed with Liz Truss, but also Boris Johnson in mind, about the qualities that you need to possess to be an effective Prime Minister. Judgment is one, and she lacked judgment. I also think that she lacks a sense of shame, and the fact that she carries on believing in her rectitude is troubling.
You talked about her being odder than most. We had Kwasi Kwarteng sitting where you are now a couple of weeks ago, and he was describing his dismissal, where he said, I was dry-eyed about it, she was not. There are some who are suggesting that she had something of a breakdown in those last final tumultuous days. Is that overdoing it?
Depends what you mean by a breakdown. She clearly had a breakdown in her mental world, because her dream, from the moment she'd become a Prime Minister, of having a free market growth-driven economy was shattered in the reversal of the mini-budget and the loss of Kwasi Kwarteng, a friend. I mean, she chose Kwarteng partly because she knew he'd be biddable. I mean, others like Rees-Mogg were desperate and thought they had a chance of being her Chancellor. No way would that happen. She knew that he would be biddable, and so he proved. And his objections were overridden. But she didn't have a breakdown in the sense that one head of the civil service during the incredibly intense troubles in the early 70s had a mental breakdown and had to be escorted out of Downing Street. She was quite rational when she came out to announce that she was leaving, and then in her resignation speech a few days later, I mean, extraordinary qualities of character in a way to keep that face strong and the voice as strong as she could make it. Everything was against her. I mean, has there been a time in the post-war period, perhaps not since Suez, when the American president has been so disrespectful of a British Prime Minister, as President Biden was of of her, with the insouciance of making a comment, eating an ice cream in an ice cream parlour. I mean, he would have been advised probably that she was toast anyway, and that he could get away with making that. But everything had turned against her. So no, not a mental breakdown, but just a period of extraordinary mental anguish, and she then, I think, had a very difficult period after she left Downing Street.
Anthony, as you've already alluded to, this was not a Prime Minister without a firm ideological mooring. Quite the opposite. She had a very, very clear idea about the sort of country she wanted to create, perhaps the clearest idea of any Prime Minister since Margaret Thatcher. But was actually Margaret Thatcher and her hero worship of her a bit of a problem, in the sense that she thought she understood what Margaret Thatcher did, but in fact entirely misread the actual history of the Thatcher Premiership?
I think she had the clearest, Lewis, idea of any Prime Minister since Thatcher, and almost any Prime Minister since 1945. I mean, Clement Attlee knew what he wanted to do. And she just couldn't budge it. She didn't have the intellectual flexibility to budge. She didn't understand people. She didn't understand Margaret Thatcher, or she had an idea. Perhaps everybody has an idea of their own Margaret Thatcher or the other leaders that we have. And she took from Margaret Thatcher what she wanted to take away from Margaret Thatcher, the ladies not for turning, for example. But she missed altogether the way that Thatcher argued with people, and she enjoyed arguing and trying to win them round, whereas Liz Truss couldn't argue with people. She just dismissed them as foolish. Thatcher relished it. Thatcher, bit by bit, brought people into her team who were going to be on side and true believers, and she didn't have that political nous or aptitude. She lived in a way too much in her own head, and yet she had some of the qualities, as I said at the beginning, that a Prime Minister needs. Above obviously knowing what you wanted to do. I mean, did Tony Blair really know what he wanted to do in 1997? I mean, the third way. I mean, really? I mean, what was the third way? This was a very clear, intellectually cogent idea based on many years, decades of thought, not the least from the Institute of Economic Affairs. But it is not enough. All leaders have to be able to have that judgment. They have to know how limited. I talked again at the beginning about the powerful forces hold a Prime Minister into place, which is why so many quite inept Prime Ministers have managed to survive as long as they have. But there are also severe limitations on what a Prime Minister can do. Is it surprising, therefore, that since 1918, the beginning of mass democracy with votes for women, hardly a Prime Minister has left number 10 at a moment of their own choosing?
So what does it say then about the health of the British Constitution, or at least the Conservative Party, that someone like this, that, as you yourself say, seems so ill-suited in many ways to be Prime Minister, became Prime Minister? Was it just a set of contingent events that are unlikely to be repeated, or did it expose some new structural weakness to our politics?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And to have two in a row, Johnson and Truss, who were unfit to be Prime Minister. They were too narcissistic. They were too self-referencing. They lacked the sense of dignity and decorum that you would expect. They lacked an ability to judge people and situations. They didn't have an understanding of how difficult and how much time it takes to deliver policy change, and both premierships ended in tears. So I think there has to be something looking at we can look at the quality of MPs and wonder whether the quality of MPs and the breadth of experience they have has been in decline.
Or the membership system.
And certainly the Hague reform, the membership system. I mean, the party in the country will almost always vote for the Conservative Party vote for the right-wing choice when it's put to them after the MPs have finished their round. And wasn't it ironic that they are a couple, Johnson and Truss? I mean, really, they didn't particularly like each other, but they needed each other. They were inseparable. Truss needed Johnson. Johnson needed Truss. She wouldn't have become Prime Minister without the support of Boris Johnson. What were they united in? Their dislike of Rishi Sunak. Johnson's support and Johnsonites' support helped keep her there. And then when Johnson quite fancied the chance himself of coming back as Prime Minister, that support, it was already beginning to weaken so much. He was already toast by then. But Johnson, clearly then moved away from her towards the end.
So if we look at the post-war period, I can't think of another time. I mean, was it an aberration? 2019 or whatever, 2017 to 22.
I think that Cameron had the ability and performed well as Prime Minister, but made some bad mistakes. But he was absolutely intellectually and in terms of his character, absolutely fit to be Prime Minister. Theresa May, I think it was unfortunate. I mean, she clearly had great skills. She'd been held down the Home Secretary job for 6 years. That's not at all easy. But the job that she was required to do when she became Prime Minister, with the Tory party so divided over Brexit, she couldn't rise to it. And her premiership is totally overshadowed by Brexit or the inability to get through a Brexit deal. But she could, I think, under different circumstances, have been a good enough Prime Minister, acting with honour and judgment. Johnson at Truss, categorically no. And Rishi Sunak, different circumstances. I think ultimately both Cameron and Sunak were too young. I mean, there could be something in the fact that Prime Ministers haven't been that young for 200 years. You need a lot of experience. No one's going to be rising to the top of a civil service department or one of the armed services or intelligence services without a lot of experience under the belt, and they didn't have that. But no, I think the aberrations were Johnson and Truss, and I think that we live with the damage, and we'll continue to live with the damage that they have done. Obviously, Brexit, and in a way, here we are in 2024, it's still too close to see and understand, comprehend really the impact of Brexit. I mean, who doesn't hope that Brexit will turn out to be a good thing for Britain? But what we can say is that it was immensely destabilising, not just for Westminster and Whitehall, but for the country at large. And I think that made it more difficult with the rise of populism. And it's very easy for populists to identify as they have throughout history, identify a common enemy over the waters or inside the gates, and turn people against that. So I think that it was a very turbulent period, and I think that the country needed deserved leaders of higher character, higher historical understanding, to take Britain through that very difficult period. And conspicuously in those two, Britain lacked that, and the loss is the country's.
It's obviously extremely early days, although Keir Starmer has already lasted longer than Liz Truss, we have to say. But what do you make of how he has inhabited the office so far in terms of his style? Too early to talk about much policy, but his style. I mean, there aren't many Labour Prime Ministers, sort of predecessors, to draw from. Labour Prime Ministers are historically quite rare. How do you assess how he's inhabited the office so far?
So he is unlike MacDonald and Wilson and Blair, who were the most charismatic. He's more like Attlee and Gordon Brown in that he isn't obviously a leader who is whipping people up and uniting them through the force of his rhetoric and his ability to win people over. But he's made a good start. Clearly, what was he doing, giving so much money away? What was that really about? Questions about that. Questions about his some of his appointments. They're always going to be, always, with every Prime Minister, there will be questions raised, and without a historical perspective, they can loom larger in the mind. But I think it's a good start. I mean, here we are. It's still only August. We're just going into September. The real show starts, and this autumn is when we're really going to see if he's able to find that story. I mean, the great prime ministers are storytellers. They have who are the great prime ministers? Lloyd George, Thatcher, Churchill, Attlee. The four of the most recent ones were all storytellers. There was a sense about, one might not like them, but one knew what they were doing with the country. He has a sense of a story, but that needs to solidify. All the great prime ministers. Personally, I think there were 9 great prime ministers since 1721. They had a moral seriousness. They were good people, even if they weren't always good, like Lloyd George or Palmerston in their private lives. There was a sense of seriousness about them, but they were also good at their job. And I think he is a good person, morally serious. And I think he is shown so far that he has the skills to be good at the job. But Britain is in a difficult position. And there is not much money, and the demands are great, and the world is deeply unstable, and there are forces coming in, including who knows what epidemics, who knows where AI is going. The difference is that's going to make, not least to employment and climate change. It isn't easy for him, and yet the country needs. It hasn't had, I think, since Thatcher, who... it's nearly 34 years since she left. Britain hasn't had a agenda-changing prime minister, somebody who has left the Union and Britain standing in the world undoubtedly higher than it was before, who has made that agenda-changing, historical-changing difference to the country, not since Thatcher. Roy Jenkins thought that Tony Blair would be that, but Tony Blair didn't leave Britain's place in the world stronger. So I didn't put him in that category. So it's 34 years. I think Britain needs to have that Prime Minister at this desperately worrying period. And it can be easy to say that, but I think this is a desperately worrying period in our history, and who will make the difference and bring Keir Britain again and give a sense of a story for the nation and all parts within it. So will he do it? I don't know, but I think he's made a good start.
Sir Anthony Seldon, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
The glib line about journalism and what we do and our trade is that we write the first draft of history. You know, we're there, we're at the ringside seat, we kind of report what's just happened. I think that he does the second draft. Anthony Seldon has uniquely kind of cornered this bit of the market where you just wait thinking, oh, well, David Cameron stopped being Prime Minister. In a year or two's time, we're going to get the Seldon book on what happened. And invariably, he ferrets out really interesting detail. And although it's not the final word on a premiership, that will come 30, 40, 50 years later, it really does give you a kind of insight. And again, with Truss, he has turned up interesting stuff about the way that things unfolded within number 10 Downing Street at that kind of critical, tumultuous period.
Yeah, and Truss is clearly already hoping and angling for kind of revisionism of her premiership, right? In one sense, it was never Truss's diagnosis that was the problem. I mean, she was right. I mean, Starmer's saying the same thing. We need more growth. The British economy has been sclerotic for too long, and basically the fact that the economy is 24% smaller today than it would have been had trend growth continued at the same rate post-2008 as it did in the years leading up to 2008, that undeniable fact is the main reason why we continue to have so many problems. Our national cake is just diminishing in size relative to what it would have been. So she was never wrong about that. It was the prescription that was the problem and the way that she went about it. And what Sir Anthony does is interesting because, as you say, John, it is the second draft of history. And history's work, like political history's work, is never complete. Different generations look back at different events differently through the light of what they're going through now. I mean, Harold Wilson, who we mentioned, is an interesting example. Generally considered in the decades after he leaves office as a bit of a failure as Prime Minister, a bit sort of grubby, the way that he leaves office, doesn't really achieve anything. And yet now we sort of look back and see a Prime Minister, perhaps uniquely, who successfully navigated the European issue, had a referendum, actually won the referendum, deftly handled it, which of course, in the light of what we've just been through over the last 15 years, starts to look rather more sparkling historically, right? So the work is never done, and the revisionism in that sense is never done, but it's hard to see how any historian ever in the future might look back on the Truss premiership and conclude it was anything other than complete calamity. And as Sir Anthony, and I've been reading his book, haven't finished it yet, it is really, really good and well worth reading, and you think that you know everything about it, and yet each page does sort of make you again be in a state of some amazement and shock that anyone like this, with her mindset, with her dogmatic mindset, with her tilt to conspiracy consistently, could ever have become Prime Minister. So I think it is going to be a very authoritative work for many years to come.
You know what? I think that on this podcast, I mean, look, we came on air almost exactly 2 years to the day ago when Liz Truss was just preparing to take over.
Oh, yeah. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, us.
It's unusually unself-referential of us not to have mentioned
where's
it.
Where's the cake with 2 candles on it? Look, we've had good laughs at her expense about her premiership. And the more I hear now, the more I just think, oh my God, is she okay?
And doubtless the events themselves, if that is the case, have exacerbated that trend, right? Because what she went through was undoubtedly traumatic, and the way she's chosen to deal with that is to bury within herself and become even more doctrinaire and dogmatic and inflexible about the way she views the world. Just interestingly, given you say it's our second birthday, just
not
checked.
A quiz question.
No. I'm just saying that that's 15 trusses, pretty much. We've lasted 15 trusses, so that's not bad, is it? Here's to the next 15. By the way, we've got a special end of summer Q&A episode for the Friday show tomorrow. So if you do have any questions about anything political or media or whatever it happens to be, then you can send your questions to newsagents@global.com.
We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.